Everyone, I'm Jeff Green, director of the Andre Mitchell Center. Welcome to the final day of our conference on campus speech battles. This conference has been going on since last Thursday, and we're very pleased and excited to have the final panel tonight on the topic of academic freedom and student activism. We really appreciate everyone who's been part of the conference and who has joined us. And we want you to know that this is the beginning of a year-long series of events at the Mitchell Center that will concern the topic of free speech battles. Just to give you a little sense of what lies ahead after the conclusion of our conference this evening, on October 13th, Mark Thompson, who was CEO of the New York Times for 8 years and has just stepped down, will be speaking about an independent media, how it can be maintained against the various challenges that are threatening it in the world today. Towards the end of October, we'll have Derek Black, who is the son of Don Black, the founder of the pretty sizable white nationalist website Stormfront, and himself a white nationalist until he overcame that hateful ideology. And he'll be speaking about that process and more broad considerations of how the problem of hate speech could be contested. Later on in the semester, we'll have events on BDS and boycotts more generally, and on online speech platforms. And there'll be other spring topics that we'll update you about in the coming weeks and months. I want to thank the planning committee who's been part of planning the conference today and all of the events in the Free Speech Battles program, which includes Joe Lowry, Sophia Rosenfeld, Amy Sepinwall, Takufu Zuberi, and my colleague Matt Roth. And it's been led by Sigal Ben-Porath, who is our moderator of this afternoon's event. Sigal is a professor of political science, philosophy, and education in Penn's Graduate School of Education. And she really is the ideal person to be moderating this panel and the set of panels of the conference and to lead us in the free speech series. She's the author of Free Speech on Campus, a 2017 book. And she also served as the chair of Penn's Committee on Open Expression. And so she's deeply familiar with various issues pertaining to free speech, especially and including the topic of our conference, which is about campus speech battles. I'll just say that I've learned a great deal from working with Sigal and from reading her work. She has argued forcefully for the idea of what she calls inclusive freedom, that it's wrong to see the inclusion of minorities and other marginalized standpoints and the maintenance of freedom of speech is always opposed, that in most cases they in fact can be combined. She's also someone who I've learned from in the respect to, not looking, that maybe it's a good idea not to court controversy if you're operating a center like the Andre Mitchell Center, but at the same time, when controversy comes, you shouldn't run away from it. And I've personally been affected by that wisdom, I think. She's also taught that we shouldn't be satisfied with mere civility when we're thinking about the norms of speech on campus. On the one hand, there's a place for anger and emotionality sometimes. And furthermore, civility by itself is not enough to stop hateful and demeaning speech, which can be uttered, after all, in a calm, civil, dispassionate voice. But in addition to all of these teachings, I think what Sigal has also done is very clearly stood for the idea that there's more left to investigate with regard to the matter of speech on campus and free speech more generally. And that spirit of inquiry has guided all of our planning for this series of events, and especially this conference. And so I want to thank her for her leadership and really look forward to the conversation that's about to ensue. Before turning things over to Sigal, let me just thank our co-sponsors for the conference, the Penn Graduate School of Education, the SNF Paideia Foundation, and the Jack Miller Center. So thank you very much. Look forward to it.
Thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I'm very excited for the event today. Our previous talks provided insight into developments of legal thought about this free speech clause of the First Amendment and about its application into the policy and daily practices of universities and colleges. If you missed any of the event, you can find them on the Andre Mitchell Center webpage. They are being recorded and they will be available to watch there soon. Today's panel expands the discussion into the social sciences and considers the historical development of academic freedom and the ways in which it operates in today's political climate. We've heard on Friday from Jeffrey Stone about some of the legal interconnections between academic freedom and the First Amendment or the protections of free speech. However, it is important to remember, beyond the domain of case law, that academic freedom relates to the freedom of expression on campus and for campus members. But it is distinct also from free speech in important ways. It affects not only the personal job security or similar protections to individual faculty members or students, but also to the very ability of institutions of higher learning to conduct research and to teach freely, and thus to enable society to expand its knowledge and make it accessible to the next generations. And we are so lucky to have two wonderful speakers to walk us through these crucial matters, hopefully to correct any mistakes that I just made in these statements. And in particular, to help us think about the ways in which student activism and their ideas operate within the environment where free speech and academic freedom are sometimes both threatened. So our speakers are Henry or Hank Reichman, Professor Emeritus of History at California State University, East Bay. Professor Reichman is an expert in Russian history, but he's coming to our conversation with experience beyond his disciplinary affiliation and also with research particular to this topic. Throughout his career, Professor Reichman has been a staunch advocate of academic freedom, and he supported institutional and national efforts to protect and strengthen its application in American higher education, both through his work at the Office of Intellectual Freedom at the American Library Association, and as well as his leadership roles in the American Association of University Professors, or AAUP, where he was a representative and also a vice president and longtime chair of its Committee on Academic Freedom and Tenure. In his 2019 book, The Future of Academic Freedom, which I kept looking for today, but it seems that I left it in my office, so I can show it to you. He argues that academic freedom is threatened today from multiple directions, and that challenges to it are central to the present crisis in higher education. But in that book, he also offers practical, hopeful advice to those of us who are looking to strengthen the conditions for university staff to conduct research and engage in teaching without risking political retributions. He supports argument for academic freedom, and I quote, by rooting it in professional autonomy, but linking that autonomy to the broader expressive rights in the service of a common good that provides the necessary justification for professional autonomy. Now, he says, if only we could convert the theoretical vigor and intellectual engagement of these works into more practical, organized action in defense of that common good. For academic freedom is hardly a mere academic concern. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Hank about all of these matters, and he will be in conversation with Joan Scott, who is Professor Emerita at the Institute for Advanced Studies School of Social Sciences. Her groundbreaking work has challenged the foundations of conventional historical practice, including the nature of historical evidence and historical experience, and the role of narrative in writing history. Broadly, the object of her work is the question of difference in history. She's the founding editor of the journal History of the Present and the longstanding member and former chair of the AAUP's Committee on Academic Freedom and Tenure, which you just heard about. Scott's recent book have focused on the vexed relationship of the particularity of gender to the universalizing force of democratic politics. This is the subject that she has investigated at least since her groundbreaking 1988 book, Gender and the Politics of History, and through many of her other works, including 2007, The Politics of the Veil, and 2017, Sex and Secularism. Her most recent book that just came out this year is called On the Judgment of History. But her talk today builds more, I think, on her 2018 book, Knowledge, Power, and Academic Freedom, which I highly recommend. In the essay circulated toward our conversation today, Scott writes about the Chicago Statement, which was the topic of our discussion last Friday with Jeff Stone, who was its key author. She criticizes the lack of attention in the Chicago Statement to power differentials. And she says, and I quote, "On the one hand, free speech is endorsed for conservatives. On the other hand, it is denied for those on the left. As public attention is drawn to conservatives as victims, those who protest them peacefully in the name of equality, justice, or climate are often punished. The right to dissent is not included in the University of Chicago's model report on freedom of expression." Discussion, the word that is used over and over in the Chicago Statement, is welcome as long as it does not disrupt, is a quote from the statement, "it does not disrupt the ordinary activities of the university, as long, it seems, as it's just talk. Protest as a right of free speech is strikingly absent from the document." And so I'm hoping that today we can discuss many of these provocative and important topics. And I want to start us off just with a very basic question that I'm hoping Joan and then Hank can walk us through. How do you see academic freedom as distinct from and possibly related to free speech more broadly? And to the extent that academic freedom is a distinct concept, are students protected by it, or are they merely the beneficiaries of it through the faculty? And we will hear from Joan and Hank, and then of course we will hear questions from the audience. I welcome students who are attending this talk as part of the classes instructed by Professor Amy Sepinwall and Professor Sophie Rosenfeld to identify themselves as they are raising questions, so that we can start off with student questions and then move on to general audience questions, which you are welcome to start submitting at any time. Joan, academic freedom, free speech, and student work, please, and thank you for joining us. You're muted, I think, so you have to unmute. Yeah,
I am.
Please.
So it's a big topic. The definition of academic freedom that I work with tends to apply mostly to faculty. That is, it's the freedom based on not their rights as individual citizens, but as their training as experts in their various fields, the training and certification of their expertise by a body of their colleagues or their cohort. Historians with a PhD in history have a certain claim to expertise in the field of history. And that means that that expertise historically has entitled them to freedom in the classroom, freedom to decide what to teach, what to assign, what sorts of material to present to students as they teach whatever it is they're teaching and hoping to communicate. So in that sense, academic freedom is a corporate right of faculty. Students don't have that same corporate right. But as students, and Hank has written more about this than I have, their right to learn is certainly governed by some concept of academic freedom. That is, students have the right to be in situations in which they can learn what it is their teachers are teaching. And I think a lot of anti-discrimination law that speaks to questions of chilly climates in the classroom, all of that kind of stuff, is a means, a way of protecting what we might call student academic freedom. But for me, the real question is the academic freedom that pertains to the right to teach of faculty and the freedom to do that in the classroom. I mean, I think an example of a threat to that freedom comes from the latest of I think of them now as faux executive orders from the president. This one on the ending of, I printed it out from my executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping. which followed upon his conference on history that was held last week. In both cases, they are going to tell us what can and cannot be taught in American history. I mean, the executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping basically says that if you teach that the history, American history has been in part at least a history of discrimination against African Americans, against women, you are furthering sex stereotyping, racial stereotyping, and undermining the unity of the nation as Trump's vision of it. I don't have much stake in his vision. I mean, I think probably that thing was written by Stephen Miller or one of his henchmen, but that is an example, I think, of a real threat to academic freedom, because it sets forth what can and cannot be taught, what should and should not be defined as acceptable teaching in the classroom. Whereas what academic freedom, it seems to me, protects is our right as historians, in this case, to teach what seems to us to be the history that needs to be taught, that needs to be transmitted. And so in that sense, I think that's the academic freedom that seems to me most at risk right now. It pertains to student academic freedom because it suggests that they can only be taught certain things and not other things. You know, that the classroom is not the place in which they will be open to new ideas and new thoughts, but given a line, an official history that they need to be indoctrinated with. I mean, it accuses those of us who teach about inequality or injustice or whatever. We are the ones who are portrayed as the ideologues. The Trump vision is the one of somehow the truth of history. So I think where academic freedom pertains to students is it's as a kind of effect of what is and is not permitted or thought to be the freedom of teachers to teach what, by their lights and by their training, is the kind of material that ought to be taught in a classroom. Hank, you want to add to that? Because then I have something to say about rights of dissent and free speech, but I think maybe we should clarify this one first.
Well, yeah, I want to pick up from there. I mean, I think that the challenges to academic freedom. I mean, academic freedom has three elements for the faculty. It has the element of the freedom in the classroom to teach, but not to just teach whatever the heck you want or whatever way you want, but in accordance with the standards of your discipline and what you're assigned to teach. Freedom as well of research, you know, but it's to, again, freedom of research to be judged by the standards of your discipline. And then the third, probably the most controversial element that the AAUP has always claimed as part of academic freedom is the right to what we call extramural expression, the right to speak as a citizen, including on topics not necessarily related to your discipline. And the idea there is to protect faculty members from being essentially punished for unorthodox ideas in their own field by using unorthodox ideas in areas that they're not specialized in. So, I mean, that's basically the definition of academic freedom for students. I think, as Joan hit it right, it's the freedom to learn. And student academic freedom in the classroom certainly presents itself as a series of rights in several respects against the professor. The right to not be judged by a professor for who you are, for your ideas, but for your performance in the class on the subject matter. What is often talked about as student academic freedom is actually the extension of free speech to outside the classroom on campus. And actually for much of the 20th century, perhaps even the first 2/3, students were thought to not really have many free expression rights on campus and many universities. And beginning in particular with the free speech movement at Berkeley, the principle got established that outside of the classroom, students have the right to express themselves. And so, for example, in a class on biology, a student does not have the right to claim that he or she is a creationist and therefore rejects the theory of evolution and still expect to pass or most certainly get an A in the class. But that student would have the same right to go out on the campus with a bullhorn at a demonstration in favor of creationism and not be punished. Similarly, to write an op-ed in the student newspaper on that. So that, I think, is the big distinction. Now, it's not accidental that those rights were established by student activists who were disruptive. In fact, in the free speech movement, 800 students were arrested occupying the administration building before finally, on the basis, frankly, of a faculty vote, their demands were acknowledged and met, and freedom of speech was established for the first time on the Berkeley campus. So student activism has always played a role in expanding student speech. But I'll be the first to confess, and here's where I want to get a little bit further than Joan did, is back in the Pleistocene era, I was a student activist myself. In 1968, I was a student at Columbia University, one of the biggest student rebellions of the 1960s. I occupied a building. I did all sorts of things that, frankly, denied free speech to others, denied academic freedom to some of my fellow students who wanted to go to class, and indeed to some of the professors. Now that I'm much older, I'm a lot more sympathetic to the concerns that many of our faculty members at the time had. Nonetheless, I don't regret my actions, and I look at student activism today not only through the lens of my mature understanding, shall we say, of academic freedom and free speech, but through the lens of my experience as a young college student myself, understanding that students, when they protest, they may get extreme, and they may act in ways that are illiberal and violate free speech, but most often they are also raising issues and expanding the issues that we can speak about that professors and others were unwilling to raise. I always was very upset when I look back at Columbia that I asked myself, why is it the students that had to raise these important issues that we were raising about Vietnam and about the university's expansion into the African-American community in Harlem? Where were the faculty? Why weren't they raising it? So I think that I think we have to look at student activism and free speech as understanding students are going to exercise their free speech, and sometimes they will do it poorly. But you know what? When students are in our classes, they will be learning things, and sometimes they will do it poorly. That's why we have classes, and that's why we teach. And so I think that we have to look in this less, and I know Sigal has been very good on this in her book, looking at this issue of student speech and student activism less through the lens of the law and what's legal, what's not legal, what violates the First Amendment, what doesn't, but through the lens of our role as educators, about what is the role of education. Sometimes we have to invoke the law, but as much as we can, I think we have to work with students to understand, okay, this is a learning experience. And frankly, I know my experience as a student, I think I learned as much or more outside the classroom as an activist than I did in the formal classes, and I'll let it go there.
Just to add to that, one of the things when you mentioned, and I mentioned that academic freedom rests on the acceptance of the disciplinary authority of our disciplines, that seems to leave out the notion of change. And in fact, there are all sorts of tensions and struggles within disciplines to challenge the orthodoxy and change it. And sometimes, as in the case of feminism, that comes from students. It was in the early 1970s, in the early stages of second wave feminism, that women students began to demand an end in my classes, what they called an end to his story, history as all about men. And it was, in fact, there were times when the student protests were difficult to maintain or to deal with. But in fact, sometimes in the classroom and more often outside of the classroom, those feminist protests opened the field to women's history, to gender studies, studies of sex and sexuality in serious ways that the disciplines had never allowed for. So there's that interesting back and forth as well in terms of the point you're making, Hank, about student protest. It can directly speak to or directly help to change disciplinary orthodoxies, which would constrain rather than open particular fields.
And indeed, students, I think that's an important point, because students can actually themselves participate in creating new disciplines.
Exactly.
Today, most universities have departments of ethnic studies, maybe Black studies or Chicanos, whatever kind, all those ethnic studies programs, they didn't exist until students, mainly African-American students, but often supported by a broad coalition of students of different backgrounds, demanded them. And fought for them, and sometimes in highly disruptive ways. At San Francisco State University, right across the bay from where I'm sitting now, we had that. And of course, we wouldn't have those disciplines now. We wouldn't have the standards of those disciplines created had it not been for students and faculty working to demand that these doors be opened up to new ways of thinking.
But the interesting thing, and now I'm going to be trying to sort of be provocative about this, but the interesting thing is that those movements did not frame their demands in terms of the First Amendment rights of free speech of the students. And now what seems to me is happening on the right is the insistence that students have First Amendment rights of free speech in the classroom as against the professor's authority. I have in that little thing that you read that quote from the vice president of the University of Tennessee College Republicans, who expresses his support for a bill that was in the Tennessee legislature that would protect so-called free speech of students. And he says, "Students are often intimidated by the academic elite in the classroom. Tennessee is a conservative state. We will not allow out-of-touch professors with no real world experience to intimidate 18-year-olds. And I remember reading that and thinking, wait a minute, what has happened to the authority of the teacher whose accumulated knowledge over the years is part of what has to be taken seriously in the classroom? No, we're dismissed as out-of-touch professors, academic elites, and my favorite part of that quote is no real world experience. You know, it's like, so, but so, I mean, I think that's really interesting that the situation that we're in now, the right to challenge the authority of the teacher is based on the individual right of free speech of the student. And that's mostly coming from the right. Not exclusively, but in the situations that we're talking about in the 70s and 80s and 90s, when the demands for opening the disciplines to subject matter that had never been looked at before, women, African Americans, various ethnicities, religions of all kinds, when that began, that is not done in the name of the rights of free speech of the student. It's done in the name of the political imperative of equality or justice. And I don't know how to think about that, but I think there's a difference that we need to take into account when we think about that.
I think there is a difference, but on the other hand, I do think there is I mean, when you were reading that for the first time, and as Joan knows, you know, we've shared that quote several times, in fact, put it in a document that we published, but for the first time hearing it now, having just previously spoke about my own experience as a student activist, my first thought was, well, you know, I thought my professors were out of touch, and I thought some of them could intimidate and stuff. And I think it is the question of what is the way, if it comes honestly from students, and I don't care whether it's conservative or not, or radical, leftist, rightist, if it comes honestly from students who want to challenge professors, that's all to the good. That's a classroom should be a place where dogmas can be challenged, including the dogmas of the professor, with the understanding that ultimately in that classroom, the professor comes with equipment, shall we say, with training and background that the students don't have. But when it comes from outside political forces, when it's being utilized and taken advantage of to promote the silencing of ideas that politicians or university trustees, etc., do not accept or want to stifle, then that's a very different matter.
And don't you think we're facing more of that now?
Yes, yes.
But can I try to inquire with the both of you in regards to these voices that students are raising, which generally speaking, I mean, you have some concerns about, but you are also supporting sort of the authentic, as you were saying, Hank, the authentic, maybe questioning of students in regards to current dogmas. And I was wondering if you could comment about the current pretty widespread concerns regarding what some call cancel culture. I don't love this term, but I'm fine using it as a shorthand. To what extent do you think students, including those that are speaking authentically, have become, maybe due to the polarized atmosphere around the country or on their campus or for other reasons, have become committed to various types of like purity tests or expectations about adhering to a particular dogma themselves, right? And as a result are challenging either their peers or their professors or others, and again, either in class or on Twitter or some other place, challenging them and even looking to silence them because they fail to adhere to what the students see as the important principles of whichever side that they are on. I'm just, you know, I have to say as a small comment, I'm not that worried about that, but I know a lot of people are, and maybe you guys are. So Joan, do you want to get us started with that?
Well, I mean, I think it worries me. It worries me to sort of see tests of purity, as you describe them, being applied either from the right or from the left. I think it's more often done, although the publicity goes to the left, it's more often done from the right than it is from the left, but we can leave that aside. I think the problem is not that the students do this, but that administrators capitulate to it. It's not up to the students to decide whether a teacher should continue teaching in the classroom. It's the deans, it's the president of the university. And those people sort of come rushing in and cave before the student demands. I mean, I think some of that has to do with the fact that we're operating in kind of corporatized universities, which define students now as customers, and it's customer satisfaction that is the first rule of delivering education, and that's exactly the opposite of what it should be. It should be the administrator's role to say, hey, this is a university. These things can be said. You can argue with them. You can debate them. We can look into whether this faculty member is in fact engaging in behavior that is unacceptable and denying you your academic freedom, that is your right to learn. But the educational possibility of actually addressing student demands is being forfeited by deans and administrators in really shocking ways. over and over and over again. Hank, you probably have specific examples. You're always better at that than I am.
Well, yeah, I wanted to, a couple of points. First of all, this may be a good opportunity to bring out one of my favorite quotes, which I use in my book, which, by the way, since you don't have a single, I do. So, but one of my favorite quotes that I used in the book from Jacob Levy, who is a political theorist at McGill University. And he wrote, he says, "It turns out that 18-year-olds seized of the conviction of their own righteousness are prone to immoderation and simplistic views. Who knew?" Well, this goes to my point of people are students and they learn. And so, yes, there has been a kind of moralistic, immoderate tendency amongst student activism. I think exacerbated, as Joan pointed out, by the broader polarization of what we're living through right now and the strains and stresses of what we're living through right now. But it still is that. And the response, it's the responsibility of the adults, the administration, the faculty members, to, on the one hand, not just simply cave in and say, oh, yes, we'll do what you say because the customer is always right and students are our customers. But at the same time, to not go the other way and say, we will not tolerate anything that's, and to recognize these are students and try to work to say, well, your complaints, we understand where they're coming from, but here's why they're not justified. Here's why there's a better approach to the issue. And, to give some specific examples. I mean, recently, the University of Southern California, a business professor was using as an example of something in a class on language and how language can be distorted. A term in Chinese that's used the same way in English, we might go, which sounds in English very much like the N-word. And some students complained that the N-word was being used in classes was very intolerant and it made minority students feel uncomfortable. Well, the administration immediately suspended this professor without even talking to him, much less holding a faculty hearing, etc., from teaching. Well, the faculty council in the business, I remember this is a business school, rather, conservative faculty, and he did a survey of the response, how the faculty felt about this. And the most interesting response is the faculty felt like this was terrible because they have all been trying to bring issues of diversity, of racism into their classes because it's important for business students because we don't want our businesses to be run as racist institutions as much as possible. And now they feel they can't even have these difficult conversations if they make one little false step. The administration will abandon them. So that's one example. But there are positive examples. Just this morning on Inside Higher Ed, which for students in the audience, it's an online magazine that caters to faculty administrators and universities, comes out every day. They ran a piece about Washington and Lee University. That's named for George Washington and Robert E. Lee. So as you can imagine, there's been a lot of controversy there. And two faculty members there have been attacked, vigorously online for their views. This is mainly attacks coming from the right, not necessarily coming from students. But the administration, for much to their great credit, didn't just issue one of these namby-pamby statements of like, well, we don't agree with what they say, but academic freedom, it ties our hands. What can we do? They went out and said, we will defend them. They have every right to say this, and it's horrible what's being done to them, and we will stand behind them. And this was really, far more administrators need to do that, no matter where the source of the criticism is coming from.
Great, and I just want to note that this was, so you have just responded to one of the questions that came up in the Q&A, so I just want to recognize William Warner, who raised the question about these relating to these particular cases and what we can do about this new type of censorship, right, of professors by either their students or outsiders. And I think you offer some effective ways of challenging that. But Joan, I think you were going to add.
Well, just in line with what you're just saying, there's another kind of example that comes to mind. The first was the teach-ins during the Vietnam War, because like Hank, I was a political dissenter and a political activist too at the University of Wisconsin in the 1960s. And when there was great student activism, and there were these teach-ins at which faculty would come and teach the history of Vietnam, the history of colonialism, the history, so that the teaching function, the teaching expertise of the faculty and the political demands of the students had some relationship to one another. There was a kind of input that I think made more serious some of the criticisms that the student dissenters had, because they had this other political and historical knowledge that they otherwise might not have had. And there's an example, a more recent example, at I think it was at Connecticut College, that there was a couple of years ago, and maybe you wrote about this too, Sigal. There was a faculty member who on his Facebook page tweeted or posted, whatever you do. I don't do any of this media, so you can tell that I'm going to use the wrong words, but posted things in which he said that Palestinians were like dogs and they should be, it was okay if they were killed by the Israeli occupation, whatever it was. They were very extreme, extramural statements. He was a professor of philosophy. And the students initially had a incredibly disruptive response to this, demanded that he be fired and all the rest of it. And a couple of faculty weighed in, and it became like a teach-in. The faculty weighed in and said, wait a minute, you can't do this. How can we turn your legitimate anger into an inquiry into the question of institutional racism, into the question of what sorts of things are acceptable and not acceptable in a university, in an academic setting? What's the difference between extramural speech and teaching in the classroom, and so on and so forth? And they turned that protest into what I thought at the time was one of the really smart interventions into this set of questions, and what we now call a demand for cancel culture, but then was articulated in different ways. So there's also a role for faculty in this, which maybe not the faculty member being attacked directly for using the N-word in Chinese or whatever this, well, not even the N-word in Chinese, but a word that's in Chinese sounded like the N-word. There's a role for other faculty to come in and say, and to meet with students and to say, there are ways to handle these problems that are, and your legitimate worries that don't amount to the Red Guard arriving on the campus of whatever university or college we're talking about. It's the role of administrators and deans not to jump in as they do, but it's also the role of other faculty to look for ways to engage what is being offered, as rather than to refuse it because it's uncivil or because it takes forms that the Chicago model, and I'm glad it hasn't become a model for the whole. Chicago wanted it to be the model, but it happily isn't the model. That the Chicago model sort of refuses. That is that protest and dissent are part of what happens. The question is, what sort of educational opportunities do they present, and how can we respond to them?
You know, I think Joan's absolutely right about that. But I think, there's an example actually I find interesting. It wasn't very long ago, just a couple of years ago, that conservative right-wing students on campus were eagerly inviting really ridiculous, provocative speakers to campus. Of course, it was facilitated by outside money, like Milo Yiannopoulos and Ann Coulter. And there was a case at USC also, where the young Republicans were all excited about inviting Milo Yiannopoulos, and their faculty advisor, because each of the student organizations has to have a faculty advisor, was a conservative professor.
That was, I think,
whether it never
at Stanford in this case, I think, yeah, but
I think whatever.
I think, yeah.
It was Stanford also, but whatever it was, he went out, he said to them, don't, he says, don't do this. Get an intelligent conservative. He says, you have the right. You have the right to invite whoever you want. That's your free speech. He says, but I'm not going to be your advisor anymore, and because I'm going to tell you it's a foolish thing to do. And I think there's a left-wing side of that. We faculty members have to be able to say to some student activists who, particularly since our understanding of racism has become that we understand that it isn't just about a few bad apples here and there and some individual bigots. There are structures, there are laws, policies, including in our universities, that facilitate the perpetuation of white supremacy. And I think we have to say to students, is going after this one professor, no matter how foolish his or her remarks may be, a solution to those problems? Are there demands we can raise that would be more to the point of getting after these structures that our analysis tells us are far more important than the occasionally stupid or insulting thing that might be said in class by a professor, or the occasional extremist extramural speech by a professor outside his or her specialty.
Great. Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think it's important to remember, as both of you are saying, the educational mission of the university and the ways in which we can use some of these tensions and even conflicts that arise to do, as you're saying, Hank, in the USC or wherever it was case, where the advisor can take the opportunity to support more engagement, or as Joan was saying, trying to use this as a teachable moment. I want to bring in Jeff Green. Do you want, okay, so I have a few questions in the queue, but go ahead.
Just one other example I wanted to bring, which brings us to the person who couldn't come to the conference today. If you take the example of student activism in the form of Uncoke My Campus, that presents yet another. That is not faculty directed or initiated or whatever. That was students deciding that the influence of Koch money at George Mason University was skewing things in such a dramatic way that they were not getting the kind of teaching and the kind of possibilities for thinking about issues that they wanted to have. And they did Freedom of Information Act. I mean, they did the kind of amazing research that uncovered not simply the dark money that was in there, but the corruption that was attached to it. The right of the Koch board, of the Koch Foundation, to decide who would be appointed to the chair that they were funding, to run the center, the Mercatus Center that they were funding. I mean, that that's an example, I think, of student activism that opens up the sorts of things Hank was talking about, the structures of power and influence that inhibit our academic freedom and freedom of thought in ways that really needed to be exposed. So that was
no, that's great, and I very much regret that the participants from UNCO couldn't make it today, but I want to really give Jeff Green the opportunity to raise a question. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thank you. Both you and Hank and Joan are emphasizing the importance of protest and dissent as practices on campus that haven't always been given proper consideration. For example, as you write, Joan, by the Chicago Statement. But I'm wondering if you could be a bit more granular about what protest and dissent means in the specific context of students who want to protest an invited speaker to campus. One kind of protest would be to interrupt that event, but then let the event go on. And another type of protest would be to make it so that event doesn't go on. I'm curious if you have any intuitions about, how important that distinction is, whether one side is better than another. And I'm asking that not just from a legalistic standpoint, but from the standpoint that Hank nicely emphasized, from our perspective as educators, what type of values we should be encouraging within the university.
Hank, you want to go?
Sure. I think, first of all, I think we have to make it clear that if there is a legitimate invitation to a speaker from a legitimate campus group who has the right to invite speakers, be that a faculty group, a student group, or etc., that speaker should have the right to speak. And the university has an obligation to protect that speaker's right to speak. At the same time, those who disagree with either what they expect the speaker to say or what the speaker has said in the past or what the speaker stands for have every right to voice their dissent and to do it in ways that are effective. I also think there's a third obligation, to the university and its leadership to provide appropriate avenues for both. It's not simply enough for the administration, particularly if the speaker is someone who is known to promote values that go hostile to the very basic principles of the university, to the very basic principles of serving the common good, freedom of expression, freedom of inquiry, toleration and diversity, etc., all these things. The university has an obligation to present alternatives, to provide, not just protection for the speaker's right to speak, but counter speech, opportunities for that, and to work with protesters, etc. There is a thin line sometimes, and difficult to determine, between when the heckler's veto has essentially silenced a person, a speaker, or when it's just the occasional heckling, because I think free speech also has the right to, in the middle of a speech, yell, "Oh, that's crap," or whatever. That's not silencing the speaker. And it's a thin line. Actually, in my book, I wrote about an instance where actually the hecklers weren't students, they were outsiders. They were retired police officers who were heckling a speaker on campus who they believed had been involved in the murder of a cop years before. I don't think he was, doesn't matter. And I had to moderate the whole event. And it was difficult because, at one point it would have been proper for me to say, look, ask our campus police officers to remove these people, which they said they would do from the speech. But I thought that would be a loss for free speech. I wanted the excitement around the tension in the room. And everybody in the end did get a chance to speak. There was a dialogue. Was anybody's mind changed? I don't know. I don't think so. But it was useful and interesting. But it was a very thin line to walk. And I think that's a challenge that we will always face. But I do think the important thing to me, however, is when a speaker comes who there's good reason for the university to believe what that speaker either will say or stands for runs fundamentally counter to some basic fundamental principle of the university, that the university also has an obligation not only to protect the right to speak, but to, and I guess this goes to Segal's principle of inclusiveness, to reach out and provide counter speech and alternatives for counter speech.
But I think you are saying, though, that the actions that would totally shut down a speech are on the other side of that line.
Yeah,
right?
Oh, definitely. And I want to think about it. It's not just that they're wrong in principle, I think they're counterproductive.
Yeah.
Because soon what happens is the whole debate becomes the shouting down, the stopping, not what the speaker was saying that was so offensive.
Right.
Great. So I think this is important, and I think it also relates to some of the earlier comments regarding the ways in which students might consider the actions that they take and the impact of their actions on the visibility of the speech that they want to actually oppose. Sometimes the protest becomes the topic, and sometimes the protest increases the visibility of the speaker or the words that they were looking to raise concerns about. I want to bring in Matt Schaefer, who is a political theorist and our postdoctoral fellow at the center this year, with a audience question from the queue and a little bit of himself. Go ahead, Matt.
Thanks so much. So there's a question from Jasmine Blanks Jones in the queue that I want to read out to you both, and then sort of pose an extension of. Jasmine asks, in your experience, is the pushback that we're seeing today against critical race theory and other like liberatory or equity-based frameworks, is this a result of these theories leaving their designated box, so to speak, of ethnic and Africana studies departments and entering the more traditional disciplines? Calls from students for courses that examine inequality seem to ignore that these courses have been taught for decades due to student social movements, but are housed already in ethnic studies. So what has changed or could change or is changing in the academy that's created such an outcry to silence this kind of learning, which isn't actually new in the academy at all, but just has been housed in specific parts of it in the past? And the extension of this that I want to pose also is how do we think about the relationship between like developments in the sort of structure of universities over the past several decades, how those have created sort of contemporary aspects of these contemporary debates in relation to like wider political dynamics, wider social relations, changes in those? Like, how do we sort of think about the relationship between, like intra-university shifts versus wider political ones? And what might that tell us about what is specific to these new calls to sort of maybe censor forms of academic inquiry that have existed in the university for a while, but are now migrating to new places within it?
Are you saying that the calls are that these existing programs are not doing enough, or that they should be done away with? I don't quite understand the question.
So I think the way that I understood the question, what was being asked was, there's suddenly, we're seeing in contemporary university discourse and then in wider political discourse, on the one hand, both new calls to make this kind of work, like critical race theory, for example, more central to university teaching as a whole. But then we're also seeing new calls, as you talked about earlier, including from the federal government, to like not have this kind of work happen within universities at all. Mm-hmm. And both of these sort of approaches to doing this kind of work on campus, both the like we need more of it and the we need less of it approach, often seem to take it for granted that it's a relatively new presence on campus as part of the curriculum, when in fact it's been happening in particular departments for a long time.
That's an interesting question. I mean, I'm not sure. I think one thing that occurs to me, and I'm not sure this is the right answer. I don't know that there is a right answer, but I'm not sure it's the answer that you and the questioner are looking for, is that a lot of these programs, identity programs, we might want to call them, identity politics program, have in fact been not always by choice, but contained within certain institutional limits. So, women's studies is here, African American studies is here. And although in those programs, there are people who are doing analyses of institutional and structural questions, they aren't always addressed that way. And some of the demand is for a larger analysis of exclusions based on difference, or how structures like universities perpetuate these things even as they're allowing to be taught critical engagements with them. So there's something, I think, in the ways in which the political discourse, at least on the left, has shifted to a more structural set of questions from a more identitarian one, we could say, that might help explain that. On the other side, the desire to shut it all down, I think is what the right has been trying to do for many decades longer than the Trump administration. The notion that the university is a place where critical knowledge is produced has long been a threat to conservatives who want to keep things as they are rather than open them up and change them. So that, you know, and the underfunding of universities, I mean, that's been a 30, if not longer process, 30-year, if not longer process of attacking, in the name of elitism or of attacking elitism, the place where critical knowledge gets produced and the forms in which it is produced.
What one specific concrete example related to this question, Matt, that you were the person posed, is in the California State University system, which after all is the largest four-year university system in the country. It's 23 campuses. We have 27,000 faculty members. I'm retired now from there, but I still follow events there very closely. And most of the campuses have ethnic studies departments, et cetera, but there was a move coming from first from ethnic studies faculty, but then in particular from the California Faculty Association, the AAUP affiliated union of faculty, to require in the general education program that everyone take a course in ethnic studies. Now, being that California is now, we may already be, if not, we very soon will be majority minority state. This is clearly an important element insofar as the university education is a civic education. Eventually this was adopted by statute. The legislature decreed it, which was, I thought, in some ways problematic. I don't like legislators telling us what we should be teaching. On the other hand, I think this is a good idea. But there were also some debates of should this be a specifically ethnic studies course, and you know, traditional university issues of trying to get more enrollment from one's own departments, etc., played a role here. Or could it be a whole broader area? But this is an area, and one of the reasons this came up goes to the second half of the question, which is the relationship to broader elements within developments within the university, which is one of the trends we'd seen in the CSU has been a consistent effort by the higher administration and the trustees to narrow and limit the amount of time that students spend on their degree, and in particular in general education courses. You get disdainful comments from trustees about general education. They say, why do we make them study history? They got it in high school, you know, which is like, you know, and it reflects a desire for this, you know, this trend that university education is really vocational education. You know, it's not a full, thorough education. And this development, I think, was to some degrees a pushback against that. And that sort of development. And that leads me to one other point on this. I recall when I worked for the American Library Association years ago, the director of their Office for Intellectual Freedom, sadly now deceased, Judith Krug, a wonderful person, I used to, in many respects, she was sort of my mentor in learning about free speech. And she used to say, she says, free speech is attacked from both the left and the right. And finally, at one point I turned to her, I said, you know what? I think that's true. I said, but the biggest danger of free speech comes from the center, by which I meant those in power. And if you look at universities today, frankly, I think most university administrators are kind of, you know, center liberal people. Many of them are decent people, but structurally, institutionally, you know, many of their actions, or often inactions and failing to come to the defense of people when we're challenged, are in fact as big, if not bigger, threat to academic freedom and free speech on campus as the sometimes pathetic efforts of extremist leftist students, or for that matter, even these harassers from the right wing on Twitter and et cetera. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that really, which is a bigger threat, a group of 19 and 20-year-old undergraduates who are, sitting in an office, or for that matter, even some wacky QAnon supporters who are sending some things, or the wealthy, powerful people who sit on boards of trustees, who appoint presidents, and the administrators who are paid mid to high six-figure, and many institutions seven-figure salaries to run these institutions as if they were businesses.
Great, thank you so much for that. And I want to bring in Professor Sophie Rosenfeld, who's a historian here at Penn and has a question for the panel. Go ahead, Sophie.
Thank you both. This is a pretty basic question. I'm wondering if you think there's a difference, or should be even, between the response of public universities and private ones. Having myself been in both kinds of environments, I've found that the responses, administrations in particular, are quite different, and that state universities often feel there's a kind of responsibility to state government or even to federal government that's quite different. And I'm wondering about that factor, since we've sort of talked about universities in general. And then thinking ahead, I'm also imagining that in a post-Trump future, whenever that emerges, there will be the question of whether people who've been in the administration are persona non grata or are perfectly legitimate sort of government figures who will often traditionally have been invited by local universities and things to be in residence as speakers. In other words, will they simply belong to the spectrum of acceptable opinion, or is there some barrier that says, this has come up, as I'm sure you know, in various places, the University of Virginia, among others already. And so I'm thinking both about the public-private distinction and about, okay, there's speakers who are sort of outside the boundaries of what we consider to be, as Hank said, I think very intelligently, sort of running contrary to all values that universities espouse, but it's harder to say what to do about an ICE official.
Or for that matter, Mike Pompeo. Can you imagine him at the Kennedy School at
Right.
Harvard?
I mean, that the Kennedy School invites.
Yes, I can imagine.
Exactly.
I mean,
that's
I think
just what I mean.
Yeah, it's exactly what, and it's the corruption of these kinds of institutions that would allow that to happen. I think, just to go back to your first question, that I think there's something of a distinction between public and private universities, that the public universities are beholden to state legislatures, although those state legislatures are paying tiny percentages of what they used to pay to support those universities. The University of Wisconsin story is a good, under Scott Walker, is a good example of how destructive the influence of a state legislature can be. And the private universities have boards of trustees who can function in a similar way. I mean, partly it depends on who's on the board of trustees and how trustees are appointed and how they understand their role, what they understand their role to be. But certainly they can also operate in exactly the way, or in a parallel way, to state legislatures. So, you know, yes and no, I think there are distinctions. And the private universities can declare themselves exempt from certain kinds of regulations, although again, the private universities are taking federal money as well as state money, and therefore become subject to, as Trump's investigations of Harvard demonstrate, you know, the violating Title IX or violating whatever. The question of where the money is, I think, is the crucial issue, and who's paying to support what institutions and with what political requirements, one way or another. So yes and no, I guess, is my answer to the public-private distinction. But the other one has to do with the, you know, the ethical responsibility or the integrity of the institution, and who knows what those guys, what they're going to do. Hank?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the one thing I would just simply say, I've spent almost all my entire career in public institutions. And I think that the problem for public institutions, they're more political in the one sense, they're subject to the First Amendment in ways that private institutions aren't. I mean, you can't run a public institution the way they run Liberty University. Not that that's a particularly great model of a good private institution, but on the other hand, of course, they're much more subject, as Joan's example of Wisconsin shows, to political interference from legislators. I had that experience directly at the University of Missouri, where you'll recall back in 2015, there was a big student outrage over racism on the campus in the wake actually of Ferguson. And in the course of that, a young faculty member did something that was probably foolish. I mean, she stopped somebody from trying to videotape something that was going on, and it became a right-wing cause célèbre, and the institution was going to handle it under their own usual policies. And the legislature essentially called in the leaders and just simply said, we're going to cut your budget by $5 million if you don't do this, if you don't fire her. And then they still refused, so then the trustee stepped in and fired her. And I was in charge of the investigating team. We put them on our censured list. They still are. On the other question of, here's an example. It's a little different from people in the current administration, which is here at Berkeley, John Yoo, who was the author of some of the famous torture memos for the George W. Bush administration, is a tenured law professor at Berkeley. And there's periodically been lots of attempts and demands for him to be fired, almost always ignored and resisted by both the institution and the faculty at the law school, rightly so, I think. But his situation is a little different. People think he got that job, as a reward for having done his work, justifying Abu Ghraib in the Bush administration. But in fact, he was a tenured law professor at Berkeley before he went in to the Bush administration, which is a little different from the Kennedy Center inviting Mike Pompeo or Bill Barr or whatever to come in and be a lecturer, which sadly I will not put past them, but it's a little different kind of thing.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Sophie, for this question or these questions. I want to invite Amy Seppinwall, who is a professor of law at the Wharton School, to raise the next question, please, Amy.
Thank you. So this is really wonderful, and it's a very nice coda to the mini-series that we've had, because it's so nice to get a historical view, a longer lens, and one of the really heartening things I think that emerges is the way in which some of the contemporary struggles and tensions are not in fact new. And I think knowing that is reassuring in a particular way. I was going to ask about counterspeech and what you took it to mean that the administration of the university should provide opportunities for counterspeech. But I actually am finding, Hank, your comments about John Yoo so tantalizing that I can't let go. So I'm going to shift gears and actually ask, so is there anything that a professor could do with respect to, work in ideas or work in policy? So obviously there are criminal acts that a professor could commit that would overcome the protections of academic freedom. But at the level of idea, substance, policy, is there a line for you that can be crossed such that academic freedom is no longer of any avail?
Well, yes, there is. And I think, the classic definition, ever since the founding of the AEP in 1915 of academic freedom, it is based upon, take the notion of tenure. That once you get tenure, which is supposed to be the fullest protection for academic freedom, supposed to be, not that non-tenured people aren't entitled to it as well, but they're not entitled to its extensive protection. It's simply that a professor can only be dismissed for cause after a appropriate hearing by a duly constituted faculty body. Now, what does cause mean? The AUP has never defined cause. We leave it to individual universities. There's some things that are obvious, right? Not showing up to class. Plagiarism in one's scholarship could be cause. I would add sexual harassment could well be cause. I think there are some things that, even if a faculty committee goes along with it, are not cause. For example, in the 1950s, people went along with fired because he wouldn't testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee. That's not cause. That by itself is a violation of academic freedom. But there is a broad area in there in which people can find cause. And I think there's good discussion to be had of do some certain people, if their cause. And with respect to extramural expression as a citizen, the standard has always been, does it reflect on their fitness to teach in the context of their overall career? And there, I think it's very hard to prove, but it may. But I also think there is a practical element here. This came out because just recently there was a discussion among some UC faculty in which even though I'm not a UC faculty member, I was a participant about John Yoo, because there were some people, especially their frustration that somebody like him could be on the faculty with them. They felt it was, a violation of themselves that they had to be on the same faculty. And one faculty member, who a good friend of Joan's and mine, made a wonderful remark. She says, don't forget, if you go after you, Y-O-O, they'll go after you, Y-O-U. And I think that's true. I think there's a certain practical element, and this goes of sometimes you have to look, where does power rest in the society? And if we set a precedent for going after people that some of us don't like, far more powerful people than us may do the same. And this is kind of part of the trade-off we have with academic freedom and also with freedom of speech more broadly in the society. And so therefore, the universities are hardly perfect places. They reflect society. The people who run the universities, private and public, represent power. They don't represent dissent. They don't represent critique. But the university is, I would argue, the one institution in society where genuine critical thought has the best chance, shall we say, of thriving and expanding and developing. And that's something we have to be understand is very precious and needs to be protected.
Joan, do you want to comment, or should I move on to, because I have a few more questions in the queue that
because time is running short too. So
right. So I don't know that we'll get to all the questions in the queue, and thank you so much, Amy, for this one. I'm going to read two of them, kind of related, and let you consider them as you see fit. One is coming from Martha McCoy. I'm not sure I'm reading the McCoy, the name properly. I'm sorry about that. And she's asking that, briefly I will quote, she would like to hear your thoughts about whether we remain vulnerable to attacks from administration, from climate change deniers, or from others, if we don't stick to rigorous adherence to the methods of our field and leave our activism to our spare time, right? So can we make a distinction between what it is that instructors and professors are entitled to say in the classroom versus what they are entitled to saying, as Hank described it, as citizens? So this is one question. And the other question, I know you cannot possibly touch on everything, but I'll bring it up, from William Warner. He's raising various questions regarding new forms of censorship, such as compelled speech regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion statements, or various other concerns that people raise about their professors that can cause them to be censored, which is something we kind of discussed already. What are some of the ways in which you think about protecting faculty speech in light of these newer pressures?
Well,
Jo-
want to go,
wait,
Joan? Or-
go ahead. Yeah.
I think with respect to the question of some things are appropriate to be said as a citizen and not necessarily appropriate in the classroom. I don't think professors have the academic freedom right to turn the classroom into a political rally, to proselytize a particular political point of view, or anything like that. The occasional political comment is fine, I think, although you have to always make clear to students that you don't judge them on their politics, that they can have whatever views they wish. However, that said, I think it's important to recognize that it's not always easy to say that we can have politics over one side, discipline over the other. Take climate change, which is an example you mentioned. Joan and I were both on Committee A, and one of our colleagues on the committee is Michael Mann, one of the leading climate scientists in the world. And Michael has been he's on our committee because he was the target of a whole lot of stuff that denied his academic freedom, became interested in the subject, and now is on our committee. It is impossible for Michael to promote his scholarship without tangling with, shall we say, powerful political interests and advocating certain powerful political things. Or here's another example. We did an investigation a number of years ago at Louisiana State University, where a faculty member, actually not tenured, a lecturer, researcher, worked on the flood control in the levees. And the university was always very proud of his work until after Katrina, he came to the conclusion that the Army Corps of Engineers had messed up the levees, and that was a good big cause of the destruction. Well, the university wanted to work with the Army Corps. It's a very powerful organization in South Louisiana. And so suddenly they went after him, Well, you could say that he was being political, but it was the politics were that of his discipline, of the discipline led him to that. And I think there's very few disciplines where it's totally possible to say there's politics over here and just discipline over here, even in areas like literary studies. And I think it's, it's important. And if we make it the standard of in our research and teaching, there's no politics, then we're actually going to become the worst sort of censors because we spend all our time sniffing out politics in order to suppress it.
Well, just in addition to that, I think that at least in the humanities and social sciences, many of us do our work with an ethical commitment to something. And so it's not ideological politics to talk about equality or the lack of it. It's not politics in the sense of whom you should vote for or whether you should support a particular position of one kind or another. It's something else. It's a set of ethical commitments that we communicate to our students and we use our research and teaching to do. And that, it seems to me, at least in when I was in college, was the most inspiring thing that you could come across, is somebody who believed in a set of principles that informed their teaching in some way. It wasn't propaganda, but it was certainly, you could call it ethics. That is now being denounced as politics. When David Horowitz does his campaigns against universities, he looks at any program that says that social justice is part of its domain. So he goes after a school of social work, for example, that says social justice is one of the things we want to inculcate into social workers. And that he sees as a disguised form of communism creeping into the university. So I think the other piece, I think you're right, Hank, to say you can't, politics and science even can't be separated, but that doesn't even take into account the ethical commitments which we bring to our work and which a university ought to represent a range of. The range of possibilities on the question of what equality means, or even on the history of slavery, it seems to me are important to have out there and to represent. On the question of compelled speech on diversity, I mean, I don't think of that even as compelled speech. I think of that as the universities trying to get themselves off the hook and not seriously take up the questions that students are raising about institutional racism and discrimination and so on, and just sort of piously gesturing to diversity as that to which they are committed, as if that was going to solve the problem of structural, or that would solve the structural problems that inhere in things like athletic programs, or the acceptance of legacy students into universities, or all of the other ways in which seemingly unseeing the structures of difference and discrimination are reproduced. So,
oh, sorry.
I don't think of it as censorship. I just think of it as public relations of a questionable kind. Yeah.
Great. And I wonder, since we are nearly out of time, and since this is a panel on student activism, among other things, if you could each make any brief, offer any brief thoughts about how student activists and those who are committed to supporting them might look at the current circumstance where so many students are isolated at home, they are not in the company of their peers, and there are so many pressures in the world around them that actually call on them to be more active, to be more engaged. But some of the circumstances themselves are silencing them, right? They are not in the company of others. It's hard to mobilize and organize and make your voice heard. And I wonder if you could offer any thoughts about the similar challenges, or about tools that they can use, or about the ways in which the voice of students remains material at this time?
It's a big question. It's a hard question, right? It's the hard question for political action more generally at this moment. I guess I would take two counter examples. One is because students are not going to be contained, even as we're trying to contain them, right? Or as the advice is to contain them. So the one example is the return to universities and the explosion of COVID as the result of fraternity parties and all kinds of violations of the rules as a form of protest, right? A form of protest against confinement and against having to sort of be isolated and alone. And the other are some of those Black Lives Matter protests, which and which I don't have the statistics, but I don't think have given rise to the same spread of the disease as some of these deliberately refusal on the part of the fraternities, as just an example, to wear masks or to follow the rules. Those also were, but with attempts to somehow engage the rules and at the same time create a mass protest, create a mass movement. So there's something in the comparison of those two approaches to expressing oneself and one's positions that might bear some thinking about or some work on.
Great. Any final thoughts, Hank, on this matter?
Well, in light of what Joan just said, I guess to go back to where I started from with my own background many, many years ago as a student activist, just bashing students just strikes me the wrong way. I just don't like it, and I don't care if it's bashing radical students who are sitting in a building, or if it's bashing frat boys who are hanging out at a bar. I mean, first of all, I mean, let's remember that many of our students at many of our institutions are returning students. They're much older. I mean, I had many students in their 30s, 40s, even older, who were wonderful students. But we're thinking now of the traditional student age cohort. And frankly, I mean, again, it's we should hold students responsible for behaviors, et cetera. But bottom line is the responsibility isn't with the students. And, you know, with all the reopening stuff with COVID, there are campuses that are doing it very, very well, and they are minimizing stuff. And there are campuses where all they cared about was getting football back, getting revenue back, and it all ballooned there. And I don't think the students are so fundamentally different at a school like, say, Iowa State, where it went out of control, or at Berkeley, where it's been actually pretty much under control. I think they're still the same kind of students. They're, you know, there's the same mix of people, of political views, of social orientations, of sexual orientation, of everything. So I'm just not into blaming students. In fact, I'm kind of amazed. I mean, there are some things that, you know, I look back and I go, my God, what could we have done if we'd had the internet, if we'd had cell phones, et cetera? But on the other hand, I look back, I look at my students today, I say, but geez, the challenges that young people face today, you know, the burden of student debt, the poor job market, and now COVID and all this stuff, you know, it isn't easy to be a student these days. And I think, you know, we do a real disfavor to everybody and to the society if we burden students with the responsibility for correcting these things. I'm just impressed at how well some of them have done at burdening us with waking up to things we need to deal with.
Well, this is just about time for us. I really want to express my thanks to Henry Reichman and Joan Scott, and to all of my wonderful colleagues on the panel, to the attendees in this event and in the prior events. I apologize to people whose questions remained in the Q&A. Hopefully you got some sense of the perspectives of our speakers, even if we couldn't raise your questions specifically. And I encourage you to watch the recordings of other events if you are so interested, and of course to join us in the future events this fall and spring. And I really want to thank everyone for such an engaged conversation on these pressing matters. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us, and take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.